Did you know that 80% of port cranes in the United States are made in China? America is under siege, not through missiles or soldiers, but through a quiet and calculated strategy that threatens it right at home. China has taken control of 37 key ports across Latin America, the Caribbean, and even Canada, becoming a true grandmaster in the global geopolitical game. Experts warn that even ports within the US itself rely on Chinese equipment. While the United States was entangled in noisy conflicts in the Middle East and Asia, Beijing built its own system of economic and strategic control, very similar to the one the Americans once used themselves. You know how the US places military bases all over the world? Well, China is doing the same, but in a far more unsettling way, quietly, subtly, and extremely effectively. By the time America realized what was happening, it was already surrounded. The stakes here are sky high. This is a real hybrid war, and China is already pulling ahead of the US, right in its own hemisphere. So will America wake up before it's fully encircled? Let's take a closer look at what's really going on. China has gained access to 37 of the most critical ports across Latin America, the Caribbean, and even Canada, making it a world-class strategist. How did it achieve this? Through the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive infrastructure project launched in 2013. Unlike the US, which often relies on military presence or political pressure, China takes a different approach, offering money and development. For Latin American and Caribbean countries, where infrastructure is lacking and debt is high, Chinese loans and investments appear to be a lifeline. For example, in Peru, Chinese company COSCO built and now operates the Changshe port, a deep-water hub worth $3.5 billion, set to become the region's biggest trade node. In Brazil, Chinese firms control 90% of the ports in Paranagua, a key hub for agricultural exports. By 2025, China had invested over $150 billion in the region, and all without firing a single shot. It echoes the US strategy of building influence over decades through military bases in places like Qatar and Japan, tying economic aid to political loyalty. But China doesn't burden itself with military alliances. It offers money with no strings attached. In practice, however, this often means long-term leases or control over key facilities. According to a 2025 CSIS report, only 10 of the 37 Chinese-linked ports are directly owned by Beijing, but nearly all of them grant China serious influence, the ability to monitor trade flows and gather data. This kind of control works better than open force because it doesn't raise alarm until it's already too late. China's economic pressure is also reshaping trade relationships. In 2024, trade between China and Latin America surpassed $500 billion, with Brazil alone accounting for 70% of China's total soy imports. State-owned companies like COFCO are building massive export terminals, including a facility in the port of Santos, to boost agricultural exports. It's reminiscent of how the US once controlled Middle East oil shipments through the dollar and military agreements. But China is betting not on weapons, but on economic dependence. It is building a web of influence that can no longer be torn apart. Countries like Venezuela and Ecuador, drowning in debt, are forced to accept Beijing's terms. This allows China to influence the politics of these countries in much the same way the United States once influenced its allies through aid and military protection. All 37 of these ports are not just commercial hubs. Many of them could also serve military purposes. The Changshe port in Peru and Kingston in Jamaica, for example, have deep-water docks capable of accommodating military vessels equipped with surveillance systems, and they are located near key strategic points like the Panama Canal. The 2025 CSIS report notes that in the event of a conflict, China could use these ports to move ships, gather intelligence, or even disrupt US logistics. This strategy almost mirrors the logic of American bases, like Al Udeid in Qatar, which are designed for rapid troop deployment and enemy monitoring. The situation around the Panama Canal is especially concerning. It remains one of the most vital arteries of global trade. Chinese companies like Hutchison Port Holdings manage the Balboa and Cristobal ports on either end of the canal. These are among the largest ports in Latin America by cargo volume. In a crisis, China could delay or redirect shipments, striking a blow to U.S. supply chains. Remember when Trump made noise about Chinese control over the Panama Canal? He clearly understood how strategically important it is. According to a report by the Baker Institute, if the U.S. tried to reassert control by force, it could backfire. Panama might draw even closer to China, weakening Washington's influence in the region. China is using the same playbook it followed in countries like Djibouti and Cambodia. Peaceful infrastructure projects that later become military installations. In Latin America, it's doing the same, but without openly calling these ports military. But it doesn't stop there. China is even expanding its influence into Canada, one of America's key allies. Chinese companies have invested in ports, including Vancouver, as well as in lithium and cobalt mining, both critical for defense industries. China is buying into logistics and energy infrastructure, embedding itself into North American supply chains. According to a 2025 report from the Atlantic Council, this type of covert penetration gives Beijing a strategic foothold, nearly the equivalent of a military base. China's Arctic ambitions add to the tension. Melting ice is opening new routes, and Beijing is investing in Canada's northern infrastructure to establish a presence in the region. It's a kind of economic counterbalance to U.S. military exercises in the South China Sea. But China plays quietly. It bets on business, not battleships. And that makes it hard for Washington to push back without clashing with Canada itself. China is also active across Latin America, expanding defense cooperation and supplying drones, surveillance systems, and cyber tools. It has even held joint exercises with the militaries of Brazil and Venezuela. One particular concern is the Chinese Espacio Lejano station in Argentina. Officially civilian, it effectively operates as a military facility, capable of communication and surveillance. It resembles U.S. drone bases, covert but highly functional. The Pentagon is increasingly alarmed. Chinese-controlled ports could be used for cyber attacks or even the deployment of weapon systems. In the Bahamas, where Huawei dominates, the U.S. fears espionage against its citizens. According to an RMC report, the threat is becoming more serious. Again, the parallels to U.S. tactics in the South China Sea are striking. Meanwhile, the U.S. is slow to respond, bogged down by conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. While Washington spends billions on wars, China has moved into the vacuum in Latin America, offering what the United States could not: infrastructure and trade. According to a report by the Heritage Foundation, America risks losing its own backyard as more countries turn to Beijing. The irony is striking. The U.S. once surrounded China with alliances like Quad, while Beijing was focused inward. So far, the Trump administration has responded only with sanctions and statements about the Panama Canal, but has yet to produce a clear strategy. A report by the Baker Institute warns that harsh rhetoric could alienate Latin American partners, opening the door for China. America's reliance on tariffs and force is being outplayed by China's economic diplomacy. At the 2025 China CELAC Forum, Xi Jinping pledged $9.2 billion in loans to the region's countries, reinforcing China's image as a reliable partner. Public sentiment in South America is also shifting. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, in Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, the United States is losing popularity, while China is becoming the region's key economic ally. This shift is particularly visible against the backdrop of Trump's Liberation Day policy, and just when it seems things couldn't get worse, they do. It turns out that even U.S. ports, the backbone of the country's trade, are directly dependent on China. And not just dependent, but technically vulnerable. Almost all the critical equipment, cranes, software, systems, comes from Chinese companies. This raises serious national security concerns. The main issue is that around 80% of the massive port cranes, from Los Angeles to Savannah, are made by the Chinese firm ZPMC. And these are not just steel structures. Inside these cranes are software and sensors that collect data. There are growing concerns that China could use this equipment for espionage, to track cargo, including military shipments, or even disable the machinery during a crisis. In 2023, a special U.S. House committee reported that in some countries, ZPMC cranes were found to contain strange communication devices not listed in official specifications. This suggests that China may have remote access and control over the equipment. So how did the US end up in this trap? It all started back in the 1990s and 2000s when American ports, like many companies, began sourcing equipment from China simply because it was cheaper. After China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it became the primary supplier of nearly everything, including port cranes. ZPMC offered reliable cranes at low prices, backed by Chinese state support, and American manufacturers simply could not compete. Over time, the US completely lost the capacity to build such cranes domestically. Now its ports are forced to rely on China. And it's not just cranes. Chinese-made surveillance cameras, automation systems, and software from companies like Hikvision are also in use. All of these could be vulnerable to hacking. If anything goes wrong, it could disrupt logistics or leak sensitive data. The Biden administration tried to address the issue in 2024 by introducing new cybersecurity rules, but replacing Chinese equipment is no simple task. A single crane costs between $10 and $15 million. To upgrade dozens of them, many port operators would risk bankruptcy, and restarting domestic crane production from scratch would take years. There are no ready factories, no trained specialists, no supply chains. This is no longer just an economic issue. It is a matter of national security, and it must be addressed urgently, even if the path to a solution is long. As of now, the situation looks alarming. China has encircled the United States with a chain of overseas ports, while simultaneously controlling the equipment inside American ports themselves. China's influence is no longer somewhere far away. It is right here, inside the country. And now the main question is, what will Washington do? And will it do anything at all? So don't miss the continuation of this story. Subscribe to the channel and stay tuned as this global struggle for influence unfolds. See you in the next video.